It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, the founder of happyfamilies.com.au. Today I'm joined with one of my favourite podcast guests, Dr. Anthea Rhodes. We get to chat pretty regularly about the great work that she does with the RCH National Child Health Poll. Dr. Rhodes is an associate professor of public health. She's a paediatrician and she directs the Royal Children's Hospital National Child Health Poll. So Anthea, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you along again to talk about your latest poll.
Thanks, Justin. Great to be here as always.
I wanted to talk to you about this poll because it struck me as both being awful and so true and something that I could completely relate to. And I don't know if I want to admit to this, but in a nutshell, the latest Royal Children's Hospital National Child Health Poll found that while more than 90% of parents say that they enjoy playing with their children or their child, 36% said that they would prefer to do something else. Basically, what you've done is you've asked, 2,000 parents about how often they play with the kids, how it feels to play with the kids. Why don't you walk us through what you actually found beyond that one stat?
Yeah, so we also found that around 2/3 of parents said they found it hard or boring to play with their kids. And that was a more common experience for dads than it was for mums, and particularly when children were very young, or babies. Mm-hmm. We found that, as you say, parents sort of knew it was important. So that was really reassuring to us. But at the same time, they found it hard to find the time and the energy to schedule in play. Some parents said they felt like play these days is just not as good as it used to be back when they were kids, that kids have forgotten how to be bored, and that we, really need to think about what play looks like and whether it's as good as it was perhaps when we were growing up.
Let me ask you, when you were growing up, so you're a Gen Xer, am I safe in putting that out there?
Oh, that's pretty safe, safe.
Okay.
Yeah.
You and I both fall into that same category. Did your parents play with you much, Anthea?
Do you know, my parents didn't really play with me much. They were pretty busy, pretty hardworking. They had small business. I've got two sisters who are pretty close in age to me, and my memories of my childhood were full of play, but most of it didn't involve my parents. So there was a lot of us being left to occupy ourselves. We spent a lot of time, down the street, around with the neighbours, or in the back room at my parents' shop, actually, where we spent many of our hours after school. And we did a lot of imaginary play. We had things that we dreamt up, that we made up, that we still laugh about sometimes today. And lots of parents listening would be maybe able to relate to that. They'd think about the fact that we didn't have devices. We had TV, we had free-to-air program TV. So you might have half an hour in the afternoon where something interesting was on, but that was it. And things have changed a lot. This survey showed us that the most common way kids in Australia are playing today is with devices, and that they're much more likely to be doing that than they are to be playing outside. So play has changed. It's not all bad news. Play is about opportunities for kids to be creative, for them to do things that are led by themselves. So they think about what it is, they make it up, and that it's just because it's satisfying. Mostly fun, but not always. Play can also be a bit stressful. It might actually, result in kids being upset, but there's learning in all of that because it's experimentation. So it has changed, but it doesn't mean that it's gone away altogether. But we as parents maybe need to think a bit more about where are the opportunities for play today for our kids in our busy lives.
So I want to jump in with a couple of things and bounce them off you and just see what your data says, what your experience as a paediatrician says. And I think it's really interesting to go back to your 2/3 call it hard or boring. I've really struggled from the time, I'm dad to 6 kids, but I've really struggled to quote unquote play with the kids. Once they were crawling, I used to tickle them and I'd grab their legs as they crawled away and pull them back to me. And I've always loved wrestling and rough and tumble play. But if the kids want to sit down and play a board game, or if they want to, play dress-ups or play make-believe. For a parent, there's nothing intrinsically motivating about sitting down and dragging yourself through the pain of that kind of child play.
And there's a few reasons for that, I think. One of them, particularly for young children, is play is really repetitive.
Yes.
And that's deliberate. And, you would know about this with your background, understanding psychology and how brains work and how brains grow. But what kids do when they play is they do the same thing or something very similar. They just change it a little bit and then change it a little bit again and they change it a little bit more. They don't change it enough to make it interesting for us as parents. They're like, watch me now, watch me again. And you're like, oh my God, I've seen this. But they are actually changing things a little bit and experimenting and finding out, where the line is, when they've crossed the line, they're testing their own boundaries. So I think it's that repetition about play that can be so tedious for parents, but is really, really important. But I want to pick up on something else you said there. I was talking about this with my husband, and as you know, I've got 4 kids. And I said, this study really showed that, parents don't always want to play with their kids and especially dads. And he laughed and he said, well, we can't all be Bandit from Bluey.
Ready and for destiny! Hooray!
Wow! My second day on the planet. Look at all this. It's amazing.
So for parents listening who watch the show, Bandit is, he is great at playing with his kids, right? Maybe not so great at doing some of the other tasks around the house, but he's going to lie on the floor. He'll stand there while they hose him down. He'll put the dress ups on. He'll get into the make believe, and you can see how that's fabulous and it's really promoted and it's a beautiful thing about Bluey as a show. But it's also a high bar to set. And I think what this study has really shown is that, lots of people feel that way. It's not that easy. It's not always intuitive. Some parents have said to us, I don't think I'm very good at it. I don't know how to play with my kids. But you know what? There is no perfect and there are no rules. And, it doesn't have to be make-believe. It doesn't have to be Play-Doh. It doesn't have to be Trivial Pursuit. It can be something really simple. Maybe it is chasing them down the hallway. Maybe it's more of that rough and tumble. Maybe it's just something that you're quizzing each other about. It doesn't even have to be physical. Maybe it's something you're talking about or bantering about in the car when you're driving along. So there are lots of little moments of play in our normal lives. And I think sometimes as parents, we just don't see them. And maybe we give ourselves a bit of a, raw deal. We're doing better than we think.
Yeah, the guilt trip never feels good. We pack our bags and send ourselves on one of those pretty regularly, especially when it comes to parenting. The idea that play can be whatever you want it to be, though, really resonates for me, because while I mean, jumping on the trampoline, the older I've gotten, the more gravity has become not my friend. It hurts.
You haven't even physically had 4 children yourself, Justin.
I know,
so you know.
I know, and I that's a kind of a sensitive area. I probably shouldn't have chosen the trampoline, but I hate jumping on the trampoline. But if the kids want to come for a swim, or I said, the rough and tumble stuff, or kicking a ball, and there's plenty of research that shows that dads do some kinds of play really well, and they're not that into other kinds. Let me ask you, Anthea, when you asked parents about how much time they have for play, what were their responses? Are they saying, oh, yeah, I've got the time, I just don't like doing it? Are they saying, I'm flat strap, I'm too busy on Netflix, I've got work? What sort of responses are you getting?
We found both. So we found there are some parents who have the time, but they just prefer to be doing something else.
Right.
And then there was around a third of parents who said that they'd like to play with their children more, but they felt they were too busy. And that was more common among parents who were working, perhaps unsurprisingly, than those who were at home full time with their kids. So a bit of a mixture of things, when it came to how they prioritise it. But I think one of the other big things to come out of the study that's important is that obviously parents are not the only play partner for kids.
Yeah.
So there are other people that kids play with. And something really interesting and positive for us out of this study was that around half of kids most often play by themselves when they're at home. This is not when they're at school. So they're occupying themselves. They're doing something, and this is not on a device. So this is time they spend playing not on a device, where they're independent. And that's a really important skill and really reassuring. And I think important for parents to know how normal that is and how common that is. There doesn't always have to be someone else involved in play. It can just be about interacting with your environment. And then, of course, there's siblings. For those children who have got siblings, they're the most common play partner at home, above parents, above playing on your own. For really young kids, grandparents. 1 in 10 young children most often play with their grandparents. And for teenagers, pets were pretty common in there, around 15% of the time. So lots of different play partners, if you like. It doesn't always have to be parents, and it doesn't even have to be anyone. And it's still a really healthy and important thing for kids to be doing. So leaving them to their own devices sometimes is absolutely fine.
I do have concerns that kids are playing on screens more than is healthy. Did you get any data in the poll about the screen play stuff?
Yeah, so the majority of kids most commonly will play with a device. So that was around 55% of children will be playing with a device most days of the week. And it was older kids rather had a higher proportion. So, more like 3/4 of teens, and it was less common in the younger children. And then alongside that was outside play. Less than half of Australian children play outside most days of the week. It's a bit more common among teenagers and among little kids, so probably babies at the park. And, teens are maybe getting out independently a bit more. But through that primary school age group, certainly well under half of Australian kids getting outside most days. So, and that looked the same regardless whether they were boys or girls, which was really interesting to us as well. So a big reminder there about how important it is for kids to get outdoors. We know lots of things, and you know this well. I've heard you talk about it before, the benefits of being in nature, in the environment, and then, of course, that physically active play that is much more likely to be happening if you're outside. And related to that was where outside they play. So, is it in your own backyard? Is it in your street? Is it down the road? And for families who had access to a backyard, most commonly it was still at home. But for teenagers, we're seeing that they're getting away from home. They might be out at the park. And those primary school age kids generally, less commonly outside. If they are, it's still at home in the backyard. So, primary school age kids roaming the neighbourhood really isn't happening like it used to when you look at the data that we collected.
So, Dr. Rhodes, when we are talking about play, I want to sort of go back to my childhood for a second, which is probably inappropriate because we're not living in the 70s or the 80s anymore. But I've got to ask anyway. When I was a kid, I used to build billy carts and ride them down steep hills. And I used to make homemade skateboard ramps and damage and bruise my body in all kinds of ways. And as I got older and became a teenager, I used to catch the bus to the beach and jump off the rocks and go surfing in conditions that were not safe, frankly, especially for my limited ability. Are kids today taking risks like we used to back in my day?
And look, you live to tell the tale, Justin. So, yeah, you're absolutely spot on. A really interesting finding from the study was that around a third of parents feel play should not involve any risk at all.
Wow.
And one of the main barriers to children getting outdoors to play was concerns about safety in the environment. And when we say safety, it's not strangers necessarily.
Yep.
It's other things like accident, injury, traffic, those sorts of risks. And we're talking about older kids, not young children where obviously there are genuine hazards and risks. You've got to be really careful. But where we might say, you know what, if you weigh that up, it's probably okay. But parents often, in around a third of cases, don't necessarily agree that it is anymore. So things have changed, and our ability to sit comfortably with risk when it comes to our children has absolutely, as a society, shifted. There's always been a spectrum. There's always been the parent who was not going to be allowing the things that you were doing, and there's always going to be the parent who's letting stuff go on that most parents won't, and that's probably where all the kids end up. But they're at Johnny's house. But, in terms of what on average we feel comfortable with as a society, it's really shifted away from risk. And one of the really important messages, I think, in that is that actually risk in play is a key part to how it's educational and how children learn. So it's a bit experimental play, as we've talked about. And by testing a boundary and understanding if you've, gone too far in a playful situation, that's how you learn. So it's very important. We're not suggesting kids are put in situations where the risk is really high and something is very hazardous, but where it's just around the boundaries of comfort, trying something independently, getting out there by themselves, but, having a plan for a safety net or a backup, having a plan to what they'll do if it doesn't go right, then that way you're giving them a chance to learn by testing things out.
One more question for you around play, parents, schedules. What about just the extracurricular activities? I guess what I'm curious about is whether or not you found any evidence of kids being overscheduled and the kids not having time for play, let alone the parents not being inclined to play. Any data around that you found compelling and useful for this conversation?
Yeah, so definitely, about a quarter of parents reported they didn't have enough time for play because they were busy doing other things. And commonly those things involved scheduled activities. So there is no doubt that extracurricular activities do impact on free play opportunities for kids. Some parents had, if you like, a misunderstanding that scheduled sport and arranged, training activities are play. They can be playful and they're certainly good for kids in other ways. There might be lots of benefits there. I'm certainly not suggesting kids shouldn't get out there and get involved in community sport, but they're not generally child-led and free in terms of agenda and activity in the way that true play is. So the learning and the benefits and the experience are different. So it does suggest, our study, we're back to scheduled activities. They all disappeared for a while in COVID and we saw much more traditional patterns of play happening. Kids were back riding around the streets. They were digging holes. They were, building things in trees because all that scheduled time activity, went away. So really interesting to see that we pretty much swung right back. Some families are still not doing as much as they did before. They maybe feel like they've found a new balance, but then for others, it's all back on. So it's going to be different for every child and every kid. But there's definitely consideration there that if you fill time with stuff that's organised and scheduled, there's going to be less time for the free activity. And that's where some of the real learning happens when it comes to play.
Dr Anthea Rhodes, always a delight to talk to you. Dr Anthea Rhodes, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast again.
My pleasure, Justin. Great to chat as always.
That is Dr Anthea Rhodes. She is the director of the Royal Children's Hospital Child Health Poll. Look forward to having Anthea back on the podcast again real soon. Paediatrician, mum of 4, and all-round fabulous lady. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. And if you'd like more info about how to make your family happier, visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.